for joining us for our Av Safety seminar series entitled Whether to Fly. My name is Tim Penney. I'm an Aviation Safety Advisor with CASA down in the southern region of Australia. This Aviation Safety seminar, Whether to Fly, has been roadshowed around Australia for the last 18 months and has proven extremely popular with not only VFR pilots but also with IFR pilots around the country. So sit back, relax, and let me just take you through this really important seminar, which deals with a topic that we really have to roll out at least every 5 years or so, because unfortunately, pilots who are flying visually are still finding themselves in trouble in hazardous conditions that are usually way above and beyond their experience and their levels of training. So Whether to Fly is a really important seminar, and there are three main things that we want to have a look at today as we go through this topic. The first is what? What is the actual problem? What is the problem that we have in this country, and not only in Australia, but around the world, especially with VFR pilots flying into weather conditions that are above and beyond their levels of experience and training? We're going to have a look at some statistics that bear this information out. The second thing we're going to have a look at is why. Why do pilots continue, even with all the education that has been put out to the industry, why do pilots continue to find themselves in weather conditions that represent significant hazards to their ongoing safety? And finally, we'll look at really how. How can we as aviators put into place strategies to prevent us from going into these types of weather conditions in the first place? So our roadmap today really takes us along 5 key steps. The first is looking at things like statistics. A good statistician, of course, can make any statistic read exactly what they want to read, but by having a brief look at some stats on this topic, it at least gives us a frame of reference within which to operate. Secondly, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time looking at pre-flight preparation. The thing about preparing for your flight before you get off the ground is that the more thorough you can be with your pre-flight prep, exponentially it increases the chances of a successful outcome for your flight. And we're going to have a look at the various tools and pieces of guidance that you have available at your disposal before you go flying. We're going to have a look at information that pilots have available to them en route. So even when you're in the air, you still, as an aviator, have access to a wide variety of information from all different types of sources that can assist you with your decision making. And speaking of decision making, we're going to spend some time looking at exactly how pilots make decisions and some of the traps about decision making. One of the key take-home messages from our chat about decision making is that good decision making actually takes time. So we're just going to investigate how humans, or more specifically, how pilots make those decisions in the air. And finally, we're going to have a look, to finish our seminar, we're going to look at spatial disorientation. We're going to find out a bit along the lines of what it is and how we as pilots can avoid putting ourselves into situations where we are likely to become spatially disoriented. So that's our roadmap for about the next 45 minutes or so. So as I said before, sit back and relax, and hopefully all pilots watching this video can take away a few little pieces of information that they can apply to their own flying. So the first thing we're going to look at is statistics. Many of our statistics come from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. The ATSB in Australia is our prime investigative body for all types of aviation incidents and accidents. The ATSB have a wide, very comprehensive database of all this information, and they regularly mine that database to come out with snapshots of safety all across the industry. So with regards to the ATSB actually carried out an analysis of weather-related accidents. Really, they took a decade snapshot, a 10-year snapshot from June 2009 all the way to June 2019. And the information they got out of those statistics, out of their database, was actually quite telling. It actually showed in that decade that they had over 100 cases of VFR into IMC actually reported into their database. That is, VFR trained pilots, VFR qualified pilots flying into instrument meteorological conditions. Over 100 cases reported on their database, but in essence, chances are that there are probably a lot more cases in reality, but these were the ones that were just reported. So out of those cases that were reported, we saw 21 fatalities over 9 accidents. And statistics, when we speak about them often, can be quite dry and almost impersonal. But the thing we need to remember about statistics is that, especially in a subject like this, we're dealing with real people. We're dealing with real tragedy. So these statistics very much have a human element to it. So in that 10-year period, we're looking at 21 people that lost their lives in 9 fatalities. Basically, the way the ATSB crunched the figures, we're looking at something like 1 in 10 VFR into IMC events are actually fatal. Okay, not good odds. So let's take these statistics a little bit further. When we look at all these accident and incident reports in this ATSB database, the one thing that does stand out is the chances of a VFR pilot flying into IMC conditions actually increases as the flight progresses. And when we drill down even further, we find that the largest chance of a VFR into IMC event occurring is not at the start of a flight, but it's actually in that last 20% of the total flight distance. Okay, that last 20%. I suppose it's very easy for a pilot to have the discipline to turn around and return back to their departure point if the weather is unsuitable in the first 10 minutes of the flight. But it takes a lot of discipline, it takes a lot of airmanship, it takes good decision making to actually choose to enact a plan B if the weather is not suitable, even when you can see your destination. And you may have flown 200 or 300 miles, and you may be in that last few miles before you actually arrive. It takes a lot of discipline to turn around. The thing about VFR into IMC accidents, the chances of survival are usually not very good. The VFR into IMC accident is not an accident you want to have. And it's second only to the mid-air collision when it comes to chances of fatality. So these are accidents we certainly don't want to be involved in. And unfortunately, for the private and recreational pilot, private operations account for significantly more than half of all of these VFR into IMC incidents, about 60%. I suppose the thing that concerns me potentially most is that 40% of these actual events are not private operations. They might be even commercial operations or something more. So what are we going to have a look at now? This is a really telling slide that we've actually broadcast before in previous seminars, and it actually shows from the statistical database that the ATSB took out of that study that the greatest chance of, or the greatest number of VFR into IMC events usually occur not with people with less than 50 hours, not with people with in excess of 2,000 hours, but the sweet spot is really those numbers of hours between about 100 hours and about the 800 hour mark. That is the sweet spot with total aeronautical experience that most pilots who are suffering VFR into IMC incidents or accidents are finding themselves. And when we run this seminar around Australia, most of our audience usually falls into that category between about 100 hours of total aeronautical experience all the way up to about the 800 hour mark. That, statistically anyway, is the sweet spot. It doesn't mean that people with less than 50 hours can suffer a VFR into IMC event. Surely not. The thing is, with people with low levels of experience, is that they're usually on quite a tight leash and they're quite highly supervised, whether it be a flying school or an aero club. And people, of course, with more than 2,000 hours and multiple thousands of hours, hopefully by that level of experience, they will have potentially learnt some lessons as they had progressed through their aviation career and have got levels of experience that will enable them to perhaps be better decision makers. But it really is that 100 hour to about the 800 hour mark that we're focusing on. What I want to do now is spend some time talking about pre-flight preparation, because it's in the pre-flight phase when we're perhaps more relaxed, we find ourselves less stressed. That's where we have the greatest opportunity to put into place strategies that are going to keep us out of harm's way. One of the things that we have produced in our CASA safety promotions area is this pre-flight preparation or minimums checklist, a personal minimums checklist, which has a whole heap of memory joggers or different factors that we ask pilots to think about before they go flying. This pre-flight minimums checklist is available on our online store, and it's also included in our flight planning kit in the orange folders. I'm sure you may have seen some of those around the aero clubs and the flying clubs or the flying schools in the last couple of years. Pre-flight personal minimums are something that we ask all pilots to think about before they go flying. It might only take you 3 to 5 minutes, but at least it is some type of memory discipline to think about the things that might be pertaining to your flight when it comes to your own comfortable, or what those minimums are that you are willing to accept. And the thing about these is that they are very personal. Obviously, the personal minimums that a pilot will accept or should accept when they fly 3 times a year is going to be completely different to a pilot that might be flying 3 or 4 times a week. So let's have a look at some of these personal minimums. And we really ask pilots to just spend maybe 3 to 5 minutes and ask themselves just a few quick questions. First of all, are you actually qualified to fly in IMC? And for VFR only pilots, of course, the answer is no. But even for IFR pilots, all countries have very strict recency requirements in order for you to exercise the privileges of your instrument rating. So that's probably the first question. Am I actually qualified to fly in IMC, or am I VFR only? The second question could be something along the lines of, do I know how the actual equipment on my aircraft works? Especially equipment that might assist me should I encounter bad weather. For example, do I know how my gyro instruments work? Do I know how, for example, the autopilot works? Do I know if the aircraft even has an autopilot? And if it does, not only do I know how it works, do I know how to test the autopilot before I take off? What are the limitations of my autopilot? Third question, is the weather forecast appropriate for VFR? A very basic question. You may think that something like that is almost too basic to even mention, but it will probably not surprise you to realise that when you look through many of these VFR into IMC accidents, it's astounding just how many pilots fail to even ask themselves that very basic question. Is the weather that I'm launching into actually acceptable for my flight? Other things that we can ask ourselves with regards to our personal minimums. Things like, what is the lowest safe altitude on this flight? Lower safe altitude is not something specifically for night VFR or the IFR world, even for VMC only pilots. Scribbling down the lower safe altitude in your area on your knee board or something like that at least gives you something to peg yourself to if the weather does close in. It at least gives you an altitude to fly at that will guarantee you at least 1,000 feet between you and the terrain. Do you have an understanding of what spatial disorientation is? Might be another question. Or put more specifically, ask yourself, is there anything in my proposed flight, whether it be a session of circuits or a flight to the Birdsville races or wherever, is there anything in my proposed flight that could potentially lead me into a situation where I might suffer spatial disorientation? Other things, just ask yourself, why am I even conducting this flight? Is it something that I've promised a friend and we've been looking forward to go away for a weekend? Is it just a quick Sunday afternoon jolly in the local area? Or are you a professional pilot, a commercial pilot, and you've been tasked with a certain flight to undertake? But finally, ask yourself this basic question. Does the flight that I intend to go on, does it actually exceed my personal limits? And it does take a lot of decision making, it takes a lot of discipline to ask ourselves those questions and be true to them. This personal minimums checklist that you can see on the screen is a really handy little memory jogger that has a series of questions, a series of scenarios that you can go through. It might only take you 5 minutes, but it's something that is highly recommended for pilots just to get themselves into that mindset about thinking about what they're about to launch into. Now, I'm not going to go all regulation on you because regulations puts everyone asleep. But regulations are, by their very nature, important, they're vital, and many regulations are unfortunately still written in blood. So from a regulatory perspective, I just want to remind people what their obligations are with regards to the pre-flight phase of flight, in that pre-flight planning. So before beginning a flight, a pilot in command must study all available information appropriate to what they want to do. And the key word here that you can see in the slide is must. Not before beginning a flight, we would really like it if a pilot could do this, or we hope if you've got time you could do it, but you actually are legally required. The word here is must. Study all available information that's appropriate to what you want to do, appropriate to your intended operation. And another key word here is appropriate. We're not asking you if you're doing a session of circuits in Victoria to look at the NOTAMs for Port Hedland or Darwin. It needs to be appropriate for what you want to do. And in the case of VFR flights away from the vicinity of an aerodrome, which is about 10 miles, and for all IFR flights, pilots need to make a careful study of the following things. And there's a whole host of these things. Nav aids if appropriate, the weather and forecasts, not only for your destination but also for alternate aerodromes. Looking at the aerodromes you might be operating into. Are they a public aerodrome? Are they a private aerodrome? Do you need to ask permission? What's the runway like? Is it long? Is it short? Is it grass, gravel? Is it sealed? All these types of things we need to consider. ATC rules and procedures. Am I going into controlled airspace? What about proximity to prohibited, restricted or danger areas? And finally, maps, charts and NOTAMs. By law, these are the things that all pilots need to consider when they go flying. Again, it might only take you for a simple session of circuits, it might only take you a couple of minutes. For a more long or more complex flight, you might have to start looking at these types of things, sometimes even days out from your flight. So pre-flight planning, let's have a bit of a chat about that. The thing about pre-flight planning is it's so useful because it minimises the chances of a pilot getting into trouble or finding themselves in a situation above and beyond their experience and training. And it helps you make your in-flight decisions, because the more work you can do on the ground, the better your in-flight decisions will be. And what it does is it helps all pilots anticipate the unusual. Good pre-flight planning allows you to put a plan C or a plan B in your back pocket, okay? Because not all flights will always go exactly according to plan. So we need to consider a number of things. Forecasts for the flight, okay? Being aware that forecasts are just that, they're only forecasts, okay? They're crystal ball stuff. The Bureau of Meteorology have all the technology in the world. They have satellites, computer modelling, etc., etc. But a forecast is still a forecast. And I'm sure most of us have been flying before where the forecast that we read doesn't specifically match the actual weather that we might have encountered during the flight. So we need to have an understanding of forecasts. Not only an understanding of forecasts, but when it comes to our MET products, we need to have an understanding of how to interpret them. And I'll talk in a little while about all the bits and pieces and the guidance material that the Bureau of Met put out to assist pilots interpret forecasts. We need to think about VFR minimums, okay, distances from cloud, minimum visibility and that type of thing. Of course, we need to consider fuel, not only our fuel to get from A to B, but all the other bits and pieces that go to make up our fuel equation, things like reserves and holding and things like that. Even an appreciation of terrain. Think about the type of terrain we're flying over. Is it quite hilly terrain? Is it tiger country? where our chances of a successful forced landing after an engine failure may be limited? Or is it relatively friendly country where we have lots of options with things like engine failures? Is it terrain that we're flying over that has lots of visual features that enable us to do our visual navigation and get a visual fix at intervals not exceeding 30 minutes? Or are we flying out the back of Western New South Wales somewhere where the terrain, doesn't have a lot of visual features? We need to think about our terrain scenario. Safe altitude that I mentioned before. Think about the safe altitude that I need to be at to guarantee myself clearance from terrain, but also clearance from cloud as well. All these things go into the mix. And finally, when to go? What time of year is it? Do I go flying on a stinking hot summer day in the middle of the afternoon? What am I going to likely experience? Probably convective turbulence, and it will be pretty uncomfortable. Aircraft performance might even suffer. Or if it's the middle of winter, okay, we might have great aircraft performance with cold temperatures, but an early morning departure in the middle of winter might bring into situations where we need to consider things like visibility and distance from cloud. These are just a snapshot of some of the things that we need to think about in that pre-flight planning phase. And the more effort and the more diligence we can bring to that, it will help us with our in-flight decision making, and it will help us anticipate the unusual, and it will give us those alternative plans if things don't go according to how we originally wanted them to. So forecasts. I'm not going to turn today's briefing into a Met lesson or anything like that, but weather forecasts are a vital thing. And as I said before, you would be amazed at how many VFR into IMC accidents and incidents that we see in our ATSB database involve the pilot not obtaining a forecast. Forecasts, of course, we have the graphical area forecast combined with our grid point wind and temperature forecasts. The GAF, or the graphical area forecast, it's been around now for a good 3 years or so. And I know they're different to the text-based forecasts that many pilots grew up with. But we need to perhaps use this seminar and maybe use this opportunity to ask ourselves, do I really know how to decode or interpret a GAF? And if I don't, where can I go for information? So we have graphical area forecasts, we have terminal area forecasts for various airports around the country. And they're only valid within 5 miles of the airport. Outside of 5 miles of the airport, strictly speaking, we go off the GAF. We have weather reports, METARs for regular type of MET reports, for standard type of weather, or species if the weather's doing something strange. And they're great on their own, but just be aware they are just a one-time snapshot. Air Services, through their NAPES portal, is the prime portal for getting this type of weather information for use in our flight planning. But the Met Bureau also put out all sorts of additional tools, and I can't encourage you enough to look at some of those. As you can see on our screen now, we have heaps of these tools available. The BOM website has a plethora of information available to the pilot. Through their knowledge centre in their Aviation Met section, there's all sorts of stuff. There's TAF decode cards, graphical area forecast information, all sorts of gear. I can't recommend highly enough for pilots to spend a bit of time just digging into that Bureau of Met website. The type of information they have is absolutely first class. You can still get personal weather briefings from the Bureau of Meteorology. Every graphical area forecast includes a 1-800 number that pilots can phone up, toll free, and talk to a weather forecaster in the aviation area. There are 2 aviation weather forecasting centres, one's in Brisbane and one's in Melbourne. And I've met some of these people and they are more than happy for you to phone them up if you just want a bit more information or want some clarity or a little bit more explanation, or if there's something that you don't perhaps understand. Don't hesitate to give them a call. They're more than happy to chat with you. There's all sorts of cameras now and webcams all over the country at various airports, at critical locations, for example, like the Kilmore Gap here in Victoria. Please make use of those. They're not the be-all and end-all, but what they do is that they add to your jigsaw puzzle. They help build up your situational awareness. There's AWIS sites that are available on mobile phone numbers, on VHF frequencies that provide you with Met information. There's ATIS services at towered aerodromes, such as Albury and Moorabbin and Essendon, etc. Don't be afraid to ring ahead to an aerodrome, especially if you've never been there before. Ask what the weather's doing, what it's likely to do, but just be aware of who you're talking to. You might be talking to someone who is not a Met observer, maybe not even a pilot. They might say the weather's fine. All that may mean is that it just isn't raining. Also, our electronic flight bags, iPads, through all the types of apps that we have now, have a host of information. A lot to sort through, but there is some really good information available online. But at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with even just basically looking out the window to assess your situation. At your departure aerodrome, for example, find, for example, a line of trees or some type of landmark in the distance. Work out how far that is from where you're standing, and it might just give you a bit of a gauge on what the visibility might be doing. Okay? Even when you're not flying at all, you might be just driving along the road in the country or walking around. Practice looking at the weather. Practice things like gauging visibility or the base of clouds. The more that you can throw yourself into this, the more confident that you will certainly be. We've put out a little flowchart or an aid memoir which takes pilots through the pre-flight planning stage, just basically questions to ask themselves with a simple yes/no response. First of all, do I have the appropriate weather? Okay, if I don't, well, that's where we go to get it. Air Services NAIPS, the Bureau of Met website is also excellent as well. If we do have that weather, does it allow us to fly VFR? We need to be aware of what our VMC criteria is. Okay, if it doesn't, probably the best thing you can do is put the plane away, stay home and live to fight another day. But if the weather is VMC, fantastic. If it is VMC, then we need to ask ourselves a question about our destination aerodrome. Is there something on our destination TAF that is going to make it a little bit marginal? And we call these the VMC alternate criteria. We find that a lot of VFR pilots aren't really aware of this requirement, but it's a really important thing to have in the back of your mind, especially with things like fuel planning and having contingencies. If you do arrive at your destination and you find the weather below minima. Put simply, look at your TAF for your destination. If there's more than half the sky, or if it's broken or overcast less than 1,500 feet on the TAF, or if the visibility is less than 8 kilometres, then you need to carry fuel to go to an alternate aerodrome. Okay? It doesn't mean you can't launch for that destination, because you can still get in even with weather as I've just described, but at least you have the fuel in your back pocket to either go to an alternate or to hold until the weather improves. Other things trigger this requirement. Things like if the forecast crosswind is greater than that for your aircraft, or, as you may recall, what your perhaps personal minimum might be comfortable with. And other things like percentage probabilities of things like fog, mist, dust, or anything that's going to reduce that visibility below 8 kilometres. Okay, that VMC alternate criteria is really important. It doesn't mean you can't launch for your destination, but if the destination TAF is exhibiting those types of phenomena, then we need to have a plan B. So if those things aren't really a player, then we can keep going with our flowchart. Will the weather allow me to fly a safe altitude for the route? If it doesn't, then I might need to think about an alternative route to avoid the bad weather. If it does, do I have sufficient fuel? If I don't have sufficient fuel, then I might have to either offload passengers or freight, or perhaps organise a refuelling stop en route. If I do have sufficient fuel, check weight and balance, make sure that's all good to go. Again, if my weight and balance is a bit dodgy, again, I might have to fiddle with my fuel load, I might have to fiddle with the amount of payload I have on board. But if that's all fine and beaut, then away we go and we enjoy our flight. Now this little flow chart, again, it's not the be all and end all, but it's just a little memory jogger for you to consider in the hours leading up to your flight, whether or not there's anything that we need to specifically consider. And the one I do recommend to you most out of this is that VMC alternate criteria. Really important that we get our head around that. What we're going to do now is have a bit of a look at a case study. Through our Av Safety seminar program, and also with our safety promotion people through our magazine as well, we lean very heavily on case studies. ATSB reports that are published, all in the public domain, have a host of information that we can use as pilots and apply to our own flying. Let's not let these accident reports sit on a shelf and gather dust. Let's mine these reports for all types of information that we can apply to our own flying, so we perhaps can learn from others' misfortune. We're here whenever we look at an accident report. We're not here to pass judgment. We're not here to ridicule or to point fingers, because often the people involved, are deceased. What we're doing with case studies is to try and learn from some of the causal factors that are out in that public report and apply these to our own flying. So let's look at a case study that involved a VFR into IMC fatality. And this occurred out in the central western New South Wales, just to the west of the Hunter Valley, and it was a flight from Mudgee up to an ALA near Glen Innes. One of the things that you can see perhaps on the slide is that this accident occurred in a region of New South Wales that was very mountainous, very hilly. Terrain goes up in excess of 4,000 feet. Certainly a very challenging area over which to fly. Now, this accident occurred quite a while ago now, December 2008. It was a Cessna 172 and it was being flown by a private pilot, a PPL holder. This private pilot had about 170 odd hours, but was a VMC or a VFR only pilot. This individual only had just over 2 hours of instrument time, which was most likely time spent under the hood during BFRs and stuff like that. This pilot actually conducted a flight review the previous day. Now, this accident occurred on Christmas Eve. It was December the 24th. So it was summertime, and this accident occurred in the afternoon. In the morning of the flight, this pilot and a passenger took off from this ALA at Glen Innes and flew down to Mudgee to do some work or to see people down at Mudgee for the day. They arrived at Mudgee in the morning, and as the day progressed, when they did their work, it got round to about 3 o'clock or so, mid-afternoon, and it was time to fly back to their home base, back up near Glen Innes. So we've got a situation where it's in the afternoon, we've got a situation where it's the middle of summer, it's Christmas Eve, and the weather started to turn. The flight was from Mudgee, as I said, to an ALA up near Glen Innes. Now, let's have a look at the area forecast for that day. These were in the days before the graphical area forecast. So let's have a look at this forecast. There was broken stratus cloud from 2,500 to 5,000 feet. There was scattered cumulus and stratocumulus cloud from 5,000 up to 10,000 feet, becoming broken later on in rain. The visibility was reducing to 3,000 metres in thunderstorms and 4,000 metres in showers. Now, as a VFR only pilot, looking at a forecast like that, it should really raise alarm bells. Probably better to just park the aircraft and maybe stay overnight. But unfortunately, and I wasn't in this aircraft at the time, and again, we're not passing judgment, but potentially being Christmas Eve, maybe there was an intention to try and get back home at all cost, rather than staying a night down in Mudgee at a motel on Christmas Eve. But that was the area forecast for the time. Be aware, of course, that area forecast cloud heights are all above mean sea level, just like the elevation of terrain is above mean sea level. And with terrain in that area going up to anywhere like 4,000 feet or more, there's every chance, looking at that forecast, that there are large areas of that piece of New South Wales where the cloud was actually lower than the terrain. The pilot visually assessed the weather before departing in that afternoon, but for some reason chose not to obtain the relevant weather forecasts for the flight. There was no record of the pilot having accessed NAIPS through air services or putting in a flight plan or anything of that nature. So going back to our flight, they initially climbed out of Mudgee to 5,000 feet, noticing that the weather ahead was starting to deteriorate. What they did, however, was that they climbed to 7,500 feet to at least have a look. Now, there's nothing wrong with pilots climbing higher to have a look at weather, to make a better judgment. There's nothing wrong with doing that. We certainly don't want to give the message in this presentation that you shouldn't go flying whenever you see a cloud, because nothing can be further from the truth. Okay, there's nothing wrong with flying to at least have a look at the weather. What we want to emphasise in this presentation is that pilots need to have a plan B or a plan C and be willing to pull those plans out and enact them, and to put those plans into place if the weather isn't suitable. They descended to 4,000 feet and they found themselves in a valley. And by the time they found themselves in a valley, the weather had really closed in, the cloud was covering the terrain, there was really nowhere to go. They attempted a 180-degree turn to try and get out of this weather, and unfortunately, the aircraft impacted terrain where you can see in that photo there, that's the accident location in the valley. The pilot chose not to turn back after identifying the weather ahead was too worse for continuing. Okay, the deteriorating weather. Left the decision to turn back, unfortunately, too late. The pilot ended up flying into instrument meteorological conditions, lost sight of the visual horizon, okay? Conditions that the pilot was not qualified to operate in. Most likely this pilot became spatially disoriented in cloud and departed controlled flight. It reduced the likelihood of a successful turn back, and it precipitated a collision with terrain. Unfortunately, the passenger was killed, the pilot survived. An absolute tragedy that could have very easily been avoided. Certainly there were aspects in the causal factors put out in this public report by the ATSB that called into question the level of pre-flight preparation, and that's really the issue we're wanting to leave you with here. Some of the lessons learnt out of an accident like this. One of the key risk controls to avoid becoming a statistic, that is a VFR pilot entering IMC, is spending that time and diligence doing appropriate pre-flight preparation and planning. Okay, can't emphasise that enough. Pilots should always obtain up-to-date weather information, not only before going flying in the pre-flight phase, but also during flight, which we'll have a look at in a sec. Obviously, the more doubtful the weather, the more information that pilots are going to need, and the more planning is required in order to make good decisions. I suppose, really, when it all boils down to it, you are legally responsible for the welfare of your passengers. Not only for, the maintenance of discipline on board and, don't touch the controls and here's the fire extinguisher and no smoking and all that type of stuff. But as pilot in command, you are also responsible for managing the relationship with your passengers, and part of that is also managing their expectations. Having the discipline to say to someone, look, the weather's a bit dodgy, we're going to take off, but we might not make it. We may have to go to an alternate, we may have to return, okay? It's all about not only managing the relationship you have with your passengers, but also managing their expectations. And that rests on the shoulders of the pilot in command. Whether you're flying a Jabiru or you're flying a Qantas A380, it doesn't matter, it's the same requirement. En route information. So we've spoken about how we can get all sorts of information in the pre-flight phase. Let's talk about the information available to us when we are flying en route, when we're in the air. And there's a host of information or things that we can glean from other aircraft, air services, ATC, that can assist us with our decision making and hopefully keep us out of trouble. Those AWA sites that I mentioned that are available both by phone and or also on a VHF frequency to give us those METAR weather reports. Flight Watch on HF in remote areas and VHF. En route automatic information service we call AIRIS, okay, which provides a rolling recording of MET information for major airports around Australia. Air reps and SIGMETs when it comes to things like changing weather. Using the intelligence or the resources of air traffic control. Really, really good information. The thing about all this type of information is that it's not available on a CTAF frequency. It's not available on 126.7. Because Air Services Australia do not monitor CTAFs, Air Services do not monitor 1267. It's on the area or control frequency. That's the frequency where you're going to get this type of information and assistance as the pilot in command. One of the things I want to concentrate on, or at least emphasise with you, is a thing called VFR flight following. VFR flight following is a service offered by air services to transponder or ADS-B equipped aircraft, okay? ADS-B aircraft, or if you are only transponder equipped, within radar coverage. It's basically a service that is provided when you are outside of controlled airspace, but on request, you have to request this service. Air services will not offer it to you out of the blue. It's something that pilots can request, and of course it's workload permitting. But VFR flight following allows air traffic control or air services to monitor your flight. Okay? They will provide you with navigation assistance, they will provide you with traffic information, they will also hold a SAR for you. Very useful for keeping yourself out of harm's way or out of controlled airspace flying in unfamiliar places around Australia, like flying around the Melbourne Basin or flying around the Sydney area or the Brisbane area, especially if you're unfamiliar. VFR flight following is only available on the appropriate area frequency. You need to be transponder equipped or ADS-B equipped. If you're only transponder equipped, you need to be in radar coverage. Air services will give you a discrete transponder code to identify you, but it's a service that is available to VFR aircraft outside a controlled airspace, and I highly recommend it. That's some of the in-flight information that we can get when we are flying around to keep us out of trouble. And the final one here is other aircraft if air traffic services are not available. There's nothing wrong with speaking to another aircraft on the area frequency or on a CTAF frequency if need be to get weather information from those. Electronic assistance is now amazing. We have all sorts of apps and things on our iPads, on our PDAs that are available to us. The key thing to remember is that we have to manage this information. The information has to be up to date and it has to be approved data. So organisations like Avplan and OzRunways and Jeppesen and data originators like that are all approved by CASA. But we also need to recognise not only the limitations of that information, but also the limitations of our device. For example, iPads that can overheat or lose battery life and things of that nature. Okay. Be aware, of course, that iPads, for example, often come with inbuilt GPSs. Those GPSs are provided, to provide you with at least some type of situational awareness, but we don't navigate as VFR pilots by prime reference to the GPSs that are found in just your average stock standard iPad. They're not a TSO device or anything of that nature, but what they do is that they just increase our mental model, they increase our situational awareness. They're a situational awareness tool, but just be aware of the limitations of these devices. They're extremely useful, they're very, very helpful, but we just of course have to manage their use and make sure the data is of course up to date. We've been talking for a while now about IMC, that is losing visual reference, okay, with the horizon and also the ground. But IMC is not just flying into cloud, it's other things apart from cloud. Whenever we lose that visual reference with the horizon, we are, for all intents and purposes, IMC. So not only is it cloud, but it's also things like dust, smoke, rain, fog, even flying over an ocean, a featureless ocean, Port Phillip Bay, even down in Victoria or Bass Strait, okay, out over large bodies of water, especially when the wind is calm and there are no waves, and you might get a milky white overcast just blending into the milky white blueness of a body of water. Even flying over large salt lakes, where anything that is going to give you an indistinct or a horizon that doesn't really exist, you're basically flying IMC. So it's not just cloud. We need to think of all these other phenomena and also the time of year where they're likely. For example, dust, in inland areas during summer, especially in windy conditions. Smoke even down south in bushfire season, even up north in Darwin, where during the dry season, in the middle of the year, there may not be a cloud for 6 months. But with half of Arnhem Land and the top end burning, we get smoke drifting across with the southeasterly trade winds causing visibility to drop and the horizon to be really indistinct. Even though there's no cloud, Things like smoke can also bring us into a situation where we are essentially IMC. Decision making. Very quickly, I want to have a quick chat about decision making. Really, I've heard it spoken before that a flight is really only as safe or as successful as the pilot's last decision that they made. A pilot can make 230 beautiful decisions, but if the 231st decision is a poor one, it's really the weakest link in the chain. And a successful flight is often just a series of really good decisions. Often these decisions, start occurring sometimes even weeks before the intended flight. Decision making is a big part of aviation. Here's a decision-making guide that we've had previously when we've run seminars of this nature, looking at all those phenomena on the left-hand side of the slide there. Things like the cloud base, the colour of the cloud, things like the clearance from terrain or what the wind is doing. Basically, if 3 or more of those things change for the worse in the course of a flight, it's probably time for pilots to reconsider what they're doing and maybe head for an alternate or try and remove themselves from those hazardous situations. Again, it's not a silver bullet, it's not the holy grail, but it might just be another little piece of your jigsaw puzzle to help you make good decisions and keep you out of trouble. So things that go into making good decisions, okay? There's lots of factors that impinge on our ability to make appropriate decisions, not only before we go flying, but afterwards. Probably the big one is lack of experience in judging weather. We don't expect someone with 10 hours of experience to be as good a decision maker as someone with maybe 10,000 hours. So experience is a big thing. Pilots also historically, and there's been studies done both here and abroad on how pilots make decisions, but pilots do sometimes have a tendency to be overconfident in their decision making and also perhaps to overestimate things like VMC criteria, their distance from cloud and things like visibility. So just be aware of those tendencies to want to overestimate or be overconfident in our decision making, to potentially want to get the answer that we're looking for, to almost reverse engineer our risk assessments. Inadequate gathering of weather information before we go flying, that's a big one that's going to impact on your decision making. Another big one is also those social pressures. They can be quite explicit, with passengers complaining that why aren't we going? Or they can be quite insidious, just in the background. That pressure that all pilots feel on their shoulders who are wanting to get the job done, to get the passengers from A to B or to complete the task. Those social pressures are a big thing. And there's been many accidents, many fatal accidents over history where social effects or social factors most likely played a major role. That is a big thing that requires discipline from the pilot in command to actually be the pilot in command. You're the pilot in command, not your passengers. You make the decisions and not them. Deteriorating weather. If we're faced with deteriorating weather, and the longer we fly, the chances are this is going to occur to us. But if that is the case, things like diminishing horizons are a real telltale sign. The horizon might not be as distinct as it might have been before. One of the things we have to always think about whenever we get ourselves into a situation that might be starting to deteriorate is we still have to fly the aircraft. We aviate, we navigate, we communicate in that order. Make decisions as early as you can. Decisions that are made early are usually more rational. We usually have access to more information. We find ourselves often in a state where we are less stressed. We are more able to think things through. Time is on our hand. Early decision making buys us that time. Usually the outcome is a better quality of decision. If we have to turn around, we don't hack into a big 60-degree angle of bank 2G turn and rip the wings off the aircraft. If we have to turn around, just a nice rate 1 turn. For most private and GA aircraft, we're looking at about 15 degrees angle of bank, something of that nature. Okay? Especially if the horizon is indistinct, we don't want to be entering things like steep turns. Slow the aircraft down. If the weather ahead is starting to deteriorate, Don't keep everything firewalled and be blasting towards it at 3 miles a minute. If you have the ability or the systems on your aircraft, things like lowering the landing gear, bringing the power back, maybe taking a stage or two of flap, slowing the aircraft down not only buys you time to think and make decisions, but if you do have to do that 180-degree turn, it'll reduce the radius of your turn. So be aware of how your aircraft can handle it at those slower speeds. If you haven't done slow flight before, or if it's been ages, grab yourself an instructor and go and practice it. Okay? At your next BFR or flight review, ask to go and explore perhaps some slow flight. Buy yourself time, slow the aircraft down. Don't go charging towards bad weather with everything firewalled. Manage your passengers. Inform your passengers. Manage their expectations. Okay? The last thing you want is passengers starting to panic. Let them know what's happening. Say something like, look, the weather ahead is starting to deteriorate. I'm going to have a bit of a look and see if we can get through, but if we can't, I'm telling you now that we're probably going to have to go back. At least let them know what's happening. Keep them in the loop. And finally, if you are going to take anything away from our video today, this is probably the one. Never hesitate to jump on the area or control frequency and get ATC assistance. They have all sorts of resources that they can direct your way. But please remember, you will only get help from ATC on the area frequency or control frequency. Calling for ATC help on a CTAF, okay, or on 1267, the chances are potentially that no one may hear you. It's only on that appropriate area frequency or control frequency, that is where you're going to get the ATC help. And we'll talk about that in a while. Our final topic, and thanks for hanging in there with us. We're almost done, but I want to specifically mention this beast called spatial disorientation. It can happen to you, it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. The thing about spatial disorientation is that it does not discriminate with things like experience or the numbers of hours you have in a logbook. It can impact on someone with 5 hours, it can impact someone with 5,000 hours. Basically, the doctors and the psychologists tell us that if you lose visual reference of the horizon outside the aircraft, essentially 80% of our orientation information is gone. Okay, we're down to only 20% if we lose that visual horizon. And that 20% is basically split 50-50 between our inner ear balance mechanism, that vestibular apparatus in our inner ear, and the muscles in the seat of our pants. And often they do not agree. And we're really starting to push it uphill at this stage. No amount of training or practice is going to make us completely 100% immune to spatial disorientation. There's no magic COVID vaccine or anything of that nature that will make us immune to spatial disorientation. It can impact all pilots at any time. Things that will increase the risk of spatial disorientation, there are many things. Ultimately, it's not doing your pre-flight preparation adequately. A rushed trip to the airport after work, not really consulting the weather, okay? Maybe with stresses in your life, fighting a head cold, all these types of things, okay, can put you in a situation where you may be at risk of spatial disorientation, let alone the weather, of course. Lack of proficiency with instrument flying. Even the IFR pilots have very strict recency requirements because IFR flying is not like riding a bike. You actually do forget. Flying when you're not physically fit or mentally fit. You might be fighting a head cold. You might have blocked ears or sinuses. Okay? Mentally fit, you might be distracted. There might be stresses in your life. Your mind might not be on the job. You are setting yourself up to be a candidate for spatial disorientation. Even fatigue. Fatigue's a big one as well. Failing to transition onto instruments nice and early. If it is inevitable that you will lose the visual horizon, get your eyes used to focusing only 3 feet in front of you instead of 3 miles away. Okay? Failing to transition onto instruments early can leave you with some type of shock as you hit that cloud. It's really important that we get on the clocks nice and early. One last thing about fatigue. Just be aware of fatigue. Fatigue can impact us in major ways. It can cause us to be poor in our decision making. It can cause us to rush things. Be aware of our own fatigue. Okay? That's a really important thing when it comes to decision making. We don't tend to make good and rational decisions when we find ourselves in a situation of fatigue. No visual horizon, of course, is going to increase the risk of spatial disorientation. Quick little case study before we wrap up our video. This case study occurred to a helicopter where they lost the visual horizon, entered a situation where they lost their spatial situation, or exactly where they were in time and space. It was December 09, it was a Bell 206, it was a helicopter, it was a long ranger. This pilot was not an inexperienced pilot. This was a pilot with over 4,000 hours of experience, almost 1,000 hours on this type of machine. But was a VFR only pilot, only had 10 hours of time under the hood, probably during training or some type of flight review or something like that. Dorrigo, New South Wales, out at a national park, they were doing VFR fire support and water bombing operations. But on this day, the weather had clamped in. It was very cloudy, fog was rolling over the escarpment in the vicinity of where they were taking off. The visibility horizontal was very poor and the cloud base was very low. It was the second flight of the day. There was cloud all around the helicopter, specifically to the east and the north, and the vis was very poor, only about a nautical mile out to the west. The pilot took off and raised to a low hover and did a 360-degree pedal turn just to ascertain what the visibility was doing. A low hover for a helicopter like this might be 6 or 8 feet. Then they raised to a high hover at about 100 feet to have another look. Still hadn't moved anywhere, vertical hover, sitting at 100 feet. The pilot then looked inside at their instruments for just a few seconds, and by doing that, it was so quick they lost all visual cues. They lost the horizon outside the aircraft. They were only at 100 feet, however, lost all horizon, lost all visual cues just by looking inside just for that small moment. The aircraft wandered, as you can see by our diagram here, wandered only a few hundred metres from where it initially took off. Didn't get further in altitude than about 100 odd feet or so. This aircraft, unfortunately, the pilot lost visual cues outside the aircraft, became spatially disorientated, and unfortunately this was the result. The aircraft impacted terrain, people died. Not a good outcome. Spatial disorientation, as you may recall, as I said at the outset, does not discriminate on pilot experience. You know, this individual had over 4,000 hours. We are all subject to spatial disorientation, regardless of how many hours we have in the logbook. It highlights that spatial disorientation can be a significant risk. So what we need to do as VFR pilots is, first of all, acknowledge that we can be subject to it, and then secondly, put in place some mitigators, risk manage it. Even momentary loss of visual reference outside the aircraft can get us into a situation where we are suffering spatial disorientation. Pilots that are spatially disoriented or lose that visual horizon usually make control inputs that are too large, and we very soon find ourselves departing controlled flight. So all pilots, no matter what our experience levels, are potentially victims of spatial disorientation. And at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, if the risk of spatial disorientation is too much and I'm not feeling confident with my personal minimums, then we just don't fly today. There are emergency procedures that we can enact if we do find ourselves in the soup. Try and stay as calm as possible and keep those wings level so we don't start entering things like spiral dives and things like that. If we have an autopilot on the aircraft, know how to use it, engage that autopilot just to keep our wings level. It can buy us time and it can buy us thinking space. Stay on instruments as much as possible. Do nice, slow, gentle rate 1 turns. No more than about 15 degrees angle of bank for the type of aircraft that we normally fly in the private and recreational world. And remember that the laws of physics don't change just because you can't see the horizon. Power plus an attitude will always equal a performance. Hopefully you will have done your pre-flight preparation and be at least aware of the lower safe altitude. and please call for help. ATC have all sorts of resources that they can throw your way to assist. One of the things you can do if you're transponder equipped is just dial in 7700. You do that and lights and bells and whistles go off in the ATC centre and they will jump up and down to assist you. So ATC can assist, but only on that area frequency or the control frequency. You're not going to get that ATC help on 1267 or if you just fly around stuck on a CTAF frequency. ATC can assist you with contacting other aircraft in the vicinity, getting real-time weather reports. They can assist you with finding holes in the cloud. They can get you above lower safe altitude, etc. They can inform emergency services. They will often give you that entire frequency to yourself and just talk you through your event. They can't fly the aircraft for you, of course. There are limitations on what they can do, but they can certainly assist you in many, many ways. Know your aircraft. If it's got an autopilot, know that it's got an autopilot. Know how to test it, know how to use it. Understand the limitations of your instruments, especially things like attitude indicators, gyro-driven instruments, things like pitot heat, which comes back to even having an understanding of where the freezing level might be in your graphical area forecast. GPS can help, nav aids, radio, all those types of things. Passenger concerns. Be aware of those social pressures, that press-on-itis. Remember at the outset we said that the chances of a pilot turning around diminish rapidly, especially after you've crossed that magical halfway point in your flight. It takes a lot of discipline, a lot of self-discipline and airmanship to turn around when the flight is almost finished. Pilots do have a tendency, and it's a natural human tendency, to want to complete the flight. Okay, but be aware of the impacts of that press-on-itis. Brief your passengers, manage the relationship, manage their expectations, and ultimately know that if you are in the VFR world, especially if you have time to spare, then go by air, because things can happen, weather can change, forecasts may be inaccurate, things can come and derail us. We may have to very well enact that plan B or plan C that we have hopefully prepared for. Just finally, the ATSB, our Accident Investigative Body, they've been running now for the last at least 18 months or so, a program or a campaign called Don't Push It, Don't Go. Basically aimed at the VFR pilot flying into weather conditions above and beyond their experience level and training. And three key messages. The first is that thorough pre-flight planning, which I've been hammering away at, and having those alternate plans. And pressing on whenever there's a possibility of entering IMC carries a significant risk of getting into a situation where we're suffering spatial disorientation. And that's not the type of accident to have. And the value of at least considering, what are my personal minimums? I might only fly 3 or 4 times a year. I might decide my personal minimum for visibility is 10 kilometres. But if I'm flying 3 to 4 times a week, I might be happy with 5 kilometres. But each of us should think about the personal minimums that we're happy with. And there's no shame in making your personal minimum over and above the legal requirement. It just shows good judgment, and it shows that you've thought about what you're going to do. So some final thoughts as we wrap up. Again, thanks for hanging in there. This is an important seminar series that we have been pushing for about the last year and a half around Australia. Some final thoughts. Obtain weather information from as many sources as you can before flight. Knowledge is power. Inform yourself. Know the tools that you have even when you are airborne in flight that you can update your weather information with. Establish solid personal minimums that you're happy with and stick to them. Have the discipline to stick with them. Discuss them with your pilot colleagues. Sit down one day and go through that personal minimums checklist. It's so useful, and it allows you just to stop for a second and think about your own flying. Learn to interpret the weather. Many of us, the last time we really studied weather was when we actually perhaps got our qualifications. If it's been a while, drag out these weather forecasts, have a practice with them. Go onto the BOM website and look into that knowledge centre. There's all sorts of information in there. Don't continue flight towards a diminishing horizon. It's okay to have a look, but if it's above your personal minimum, And especially if there's a chance that you're going to lose that visual horizon, get out of there. Enact your plan B, the 180-degree turn, and go elsewhere. Don't ever hesitate to call ATC for help. You're not going to get in trouble with CASA or anything like that, but we need you to have the wherewithal to hit that frequency and get that assistance that you can have to get you out of that poor situation. That's really it for Whether to Fly. As I said at the outset, this is just an opportunity for pilots to take maybe an hour out of their day to sit down and just think to themselves, is there anything about my own flying that I need to perhaps polish up? Is there anything that I can learn from some of these accident case studies that I can apply to my own flying? Ask yourself the question, do I really know how to interpret these area forecasts or TAFs and things like that? I hope this time has given you at least some motivation to go and, I suppose, invest in your own flying, but also to invest in your own safety. So thanks for joining me, and look forward to seeing you as we do future presentations in our Av Safety Seminar program around Australia. Thanks very much.